I'm recording this for the Frontline Club podcast with Professor Sam Vaknin in the Balkan city of Skopje. It's my second episode as I look for a greater understanding of the psychology of autocratic leaders and their administrations. I've asked Professor Vaknin to join me again to talk about the psychology of propaganda and misinformation campaigns. Professor Sam Vaknin is known for building public awareness of personality disorders. He gave us the language we use today to describe narcissism, expressions like narcissistic supply and flying monkeys. By bringing academic research into the public realm, Sam launched an industry to support survivors of abuse today. Among his achievements, Sam has made academic contributions to physics and has worked as a journalist and an editor for decades. Thank you for joining me, Sam.
Thank you for having me. I always find your introductions far more compelling than the interview itself, I must say.
I don't think so. I don't think so. Yeah. So may I start with my first question? Would be, how does disinformation really work? And what does it look like under the hood?
First of all, propaganda is a bad thing. Propaganda has acquired a bad reputation only in the second half of the 20th century. For well over 350 years, propaganda was considered to be a very good thing, a virtuous thing. In the 17th century, you had the Propaganda Council of the Catholic Church. Actually, the word propaganda is another adaptation of the word propagation. Then you had propaganda in communist regimes, where propaganda was just another word for education. In Latin America, propaganda means advertising. And I'm sorry to bring them into the stew, but in Nazi Germany, the Ministry of Propaganda was actually called the Ministry of Enlightenment.
Public enlightenment, yes it was.
Yes. So enlightenment and propaganda were equated in the public's mind with education, with the dissemination of information, with the formation of social structures and so on and so forth. It was a highly positive thing. The communists called it agitation. So they had agitprop. They had like agitation and propaganda put together. And agitation simply meant the shaping of public opinion in order to attain or obtain social goals.
Sorry to interrupt you very quickly. I had read somewhere that Roman Emperor Octavian minted coins against Antony, as in Cleopatra, that he was a womanizer and a drunk.
Yeah. So propaganda has old lineage and pedigree, and it has all been actually positive until the second half of the 20th century, the Cold War. During the Cold War, propaganda was cast as this evil, malevolent activity which intends to brainwash people or somehow entrain them or somehow delude them or deceive them and so on and so forth. These are new connotations. Propaganda had to do with grievances. Propaganda is intimately associated with victimhood. There is the belief that if you're a victim, you have the right to observe the world and reframe experiences and so on and so forth in a way which would somehow support the ineluctable rights that attend upon victimhood. Victims have rights, and these rights impose obligations on other people. However, this all should be supported with a narrative, like what gives you the right, even as a victim. The narrative gives you the right. And this narrative is actually propaganda. It's a grievance technique, grievance-related technique. And finally, I would like to mention the work of Louis Althusser. Louis Althusser was a neo-Marxist philosopher who ended up exactly like Nietzsche in Bedlam, in a mental asylum. They all do. I don't know why. Very worrying as far as I'm concerned. So Louis Althusser came with the idea of interpellation. The concept of interpellation. It means that social structures, could be corporate structures, could be political structures, could be intellectual structures such as universities. Social structures tell you what identity you should acquire, inform you of your identity, actually form your identity for you. And so this process is known as interpellation. And the main tool in interpellation is propaganda. So propaganda is an integral part of identity formation, and identity formation is very important because if you're told what your identity should be, that generates and engenders social cohesion. The social cohesion allows society to mobilize resources. So propaganda is a very useful tool. In the absence of propaganda, you have social divisions, an inability to get your act together as a society, and ultimately a collapse of society. One could even say that the emergence of populists and authoritarian leaders and autocrats and so on and so forth has to do with the abandonment of propaganda by specific social structures and regimes and so on. For example...
Do you mean what sort of more conventional messaging and more reassuring messaging?
Messaging that is counterfactual. In a minute I will come to the psychological underpinnings, which is counterfactual, which is self-righteous, which is self-aggrandizing, which is imbues you with some kind of superiority, either as a victim or as an innately superior creature or whatever. But you need these narratives to engender social cohesion and bring on mobilization. If you begin to relativize the narratives, if you begin to say, that's a narrative, but you feel free to doubt it, feel free to criticize it, feel free to undermine it, then people rebel against this, and they seek someone who would give them the propaganda and the narrative that they miss, the certainty. So the rise of autocratic regime has to do with the relativization of propaganda and morality and so on and so forth. We've gone through a period of about 50, 60 years where morality has become relative, religion had become relative or shunned altogether, the nation state has been criticized, gender roles have been undermined, etc., etc. So we have lost the propaganda value of social cohesion, and we fell apart, and that's where populists and autocrats and so on emerged. The communists understood it well, as did the Nazis, and that's why they placed such a huge emphasis on propaganda. And contrary to what we believe today, these were highly successful regimes. The Nazi regime was a highly successful regime. And the communist regime until, let's say, the 1980s was a relatively successful regime. Repression, suppression, I agree. But all in all, it enjoyed the support of the vast majority of the population. Hitler was popular till 1942, 1943. He was a highly popular leader. So is Putin. So is Donald Trump. So, and all these leaders use propaganda as the main instrument of the main glue that holds together the base, essentially the nation. So this is the kind of socio-historical background to propaganda. And now let's talk about the psychology. How does it work? Propaganda legitimizes emotional reasoning. When you go to university and so on, you're told that you should use your critical thinking, your analytical skills. You should never think with your emotions. Emotions are proscribed, not prescribed. And so emotions are outcasts in the current intellectual climate. And here comes propaganda and tells you it's perfectly safe to think with your emotions. If you feel something, it must be true. If you have a certain intuition, that's a reflection of reality. If you feel, it is magical thinking, you know? So it is a very empowering notion. You don't need to study, you don't need to learn, you need no erudition. All you need to do is feel. All you need to do is intuit. You know, you need intuition and emotions, that's all. And you're fully equipped to take on the world and to ascend and to become rich and powerful and everything. So emotional reasoning and emotional thinking is the main element in propaganda. Propaganda is emotional, whereas education is unemotional. That's the main distinguishing feature. The second thing is that propaganda is usually a fantastic narrative. It leads to the formation of what we call in psychology a paracosm, an alternative reality, a virtual reality. And it is fantastic in the sense that it is counterfactual, but it is also fantastic in the sense that it is either utopian or dystopian. So you could definitely have dystopian propaganda. For example, if you vote for Joe Biden, United States will become, a horrible place. That's propaganda, yet it is dystopian. If you vote for Trump, all problems will be solved. That's the utopian element. So the fantasy is not only about factuality or counterfactuality, fake news or real news, misinformation or real information, disinformation or not. That's only one element. The second element is that there is a delineation and depiction of an alternative world akin to science fiction, of an alternative world which is desirable or utterly undesirable.
So
it's a splitting defense.
People need a story to live. They need to live with a story.
They not only need a story, but they need a directional story, and they need an immersive environment, a total environment. So propaganda provides a total story, a story which answers all your questions about everything. In this sense, of course, religion is 100% propaganda. Because there is God, there is angels, there is this, all your answers are questions. All your questions are answered. And you know, what I've just said inadvertently. In science, all your answers are questioned. In propaganda, all your questions are answered. It's a major distinction.
Yes, I see that, yes.
Yeah. So there is this fantastic, immersive, all-pervasive, all-inclusive narrative known as paracosm, shortly maybe the metaverse in technological terms. That's the second element. The third element, gaslighting. Propaganda is founded on gaslighting. It causes you to lose trust in your ability to gauge and evaluate reality properly. And then what you do, you outsource your reality testing. You say, I can't trust myself to understand or to comprehend reality appropriately. So I'm going to let someone else do it for me. I'm going to let the narrative do it for me. So propaganda is a two-step dance. The first step is undermining and challenging and destroying your ability to evaluate and gauge reality. Having acquired this innate uncertainty, then what you do, you outsource this function. It's called an ego function. You outsource this ego function to the narrative. You say, okay, if I adopt and accept the propaganda or the propagandistic narrative, then I will have restored my reality testing. Then I would feel comfortable and safe in reality, because through the propaganda or the propaganda narrative, I would be able to make sense of the world. So propaganda is what we call an organizing principle, but equally it is a hermeneutic principle. In other words, an explanatory principle. It makes sense of the world. It imbues it with meaning, purpose, direction. It creates a temporal narrative, A leads to B. And everything in propaganda is inexorable, ineluctable, inevitable. Like in propaganda, there's no maybe, doubts, could be, it might have ended differently. No.
Comforting certainty.
Yes, if A always B, so determinacy is restored, certainty is restored, and the sense of safety is restored. In this sense, propaganda is parental. Propaganda imitates a parental role.
I see.
We call it in psychology a secure base. Propaganda provides an ersatz secure base, a fake rendition of a secure base. You feel when you're immersed or in the propaganda sphere, you feel that you're back in the womb. You're totally protected. You're totally cared for. All your needs are catered to. First and foremost, you need to make sense of the world. First and foremost, you need to find meaning. So propaganda is directional and motivational. Propaganda is a type of speech. So it's a combination of cognition and speech, and that is known as a speech act. So propaganda is a speech act, and it belongs to a group of speech acts known as doxastic axiological speech acts. These are big words.
That's a mouthful.
Yes, and they simply mean speech acts that pertain or relate to beliefs and values. There is no value-free propaganda, or norm-free propaganda, or belief-free propaganda. Propaganda is an act of faith. It also requires a leap of faith, because you are not supposed to question the source. Whereas in science and education, you always question the source, step number one. In propaganda, you're never supposed to question the source. The veracity and credibility of the source are inherent in the very act of propaganda. If you generate propaganda, you're credible and veritable. So it is a tacit agreement to suspend judgment and critical thinking, and to adhere to the narrative. And so propaganda propagates values and beliefs. Started with the Catholic Church, as I've mentioned. Nazi Germany, I mentioned. Communists, they're all doxastic axiological systems. Nazi Germany, communist USSR, they were based on they were faith-based. They were secular religions. So propaganda is about this. It's about faith. It's an act of faith. What is the core narrative? Okay, values, faith, beliefs, this, that. Got the picture. But what do these beliefs pertain to? What do they say? What's the content of the belief? What's the content of the value? What is the content of propaganda? Invariably, propaganda is about othering, alterity. In other words, the other. Propaganda always divides the world into an in-group and an out-group. When you adhere to the propaganda, adopt it, immerse yourself in it, accept it, propagate it, and disseminate it, and so on, when you're an active participant in the act of propaganda, and propaganda requires you to be proactive. When you are like that, then you belong in the in-group. You belong to the in-group. So propaganda provides a sense of belonging and acceptance. When you share the narrative with people, you become a collective by definition. So there is this, I'm going to suspend my independence, my personal autonomy, my agency, my critical thinking, but the rewards are immense. I'm giving up on a little, and the rewards are immense because I'm multiplied. I'm amplified.
Part of a team.
Yes, I'm amplified. I'm simply amplified. My mind is amplified. It's a hive mind. My body is amplified. I am empowered via the agency, the collective agency, and I'm able to achieve historical things. So I acquire cosmic significance. As a supporter of Adolf Hitler or Donald Trump, I'm a participant in history. I have something to tell my grandchildren. You know, I'm an agent of change. So, ironically, suspending your individual agency amplifies your collective agency, makes you even more empowered. And this is the sleight of hand of propaganda. This is the trick. And so there is othering, in-group and out-group, and it utilizes a primitive defense mechanism, infantile defense mechanism, known as splitting. Splitting is when you say, I'm all good, you're all bad. Or you're all good, I'm all bad, and so on. So whenever we divide the world, it's dichotomous thinking. When we divide the world into black and white, good and evil, and so on. This is very primitive. Children do that prior to the age of 2. And that's why we call it an infantile defense mechanism. Propaganda uses this. It says, you're all good by virtue of belonging to the propaganda camp.
Does that mean that we've all got a bit of a child in us that responds to it?
Yes, of course. I mentioned the propaganda plays a parental role.
Yeah.
So, but propaganda also aggrandizes you. Propaganda caters to your narcissistic defenses, provides you with narcissistic supply on a constant basis. It's a safe, regular, stable source of narcissistic supply, which is why narcissists and psychopaths are highly attracted to this. You know, so because propaganda says you are all good, you are virtuous, you are superior, you belong to the Aryan race, or you're white, or you're superior somehow, and so on. And then there's the other. The other is evil. The other is defective. The other is malevolent. The other. So it's a process of othering, using the alterity of the other. And so in this sense, propaganda is an extension of the medieval morality play. In the medieval morality play, it was good versus evil, or the agents of good versus the agents of evil, or the reification of good versus the reification of evil. But there was always an all-good side and an all-bad side. And usually the good one had won. So medieval morality plays are just another form of propaganda. And what propaganda says, what propaganda does, it says, there's you, and you're superior, and because you're good. Because you're good. You are unadulterated, unmitigated, good. And then there's the other. Because you're all good, the other, invariably and inevitably, is all bad. So now we have an all good and all bad. And it's a morality play. And if you don't play by the propaganda rules, it's going to end badly. So if you don't play by the propaganda rules, there will be a catastrophe. And this is exactly what we call in psychology catastrophizing. Propaganda catastrophizes, always. So Nazi propaganda said, if we don't subdue the Jews, I mean, we are doomed. Trump says, if we don't destroy the Democrats, the United States is gone. It's always, if you don't do something to the other, you're going to lose everything you have. And it's going to end in a catastrophe. So there's a lot of catastrophizing. And because there is a lot of catastrophizing, it limits your options. So the degrees of freedom decrease. When you catastrophize, when you say, if you don't do that, your life will end, then you have only one choice. I mean, you one alternative. You must do this. So we call this process constriction. Propaganda constricts your life and the space of available alternatives and options, reduces you, channels you to a single choice, a single decision. Because if you were to adopt another choice or another decision, you're dead, you're doomed, you're finished, you're gone, you're history.
So thereby adds cohesion to society.
And that adds cohesion, mobilizes, because fear is a great mobilizer, mobilizes and so on and so forth. The last two things I would say that propaganda is a form of what we call in psychology self-enhancement. Self-enhancement simply means that you have a self-concept, you have a concept of yourself, self-image or self-perception, and then you need to support it somehow. You need to buttress it somehow. The self-perception could be I'm a good man, or self-perception could be I'm a genius, or whatever it is. I mean, you have a self-concept. And then if you think you're a good man, you're going to do good things, good deeds, and so on and so forth, and you're going to say to self-congratulate and ask others to congratulate you, or maybe become ostentatious in your charity and altruism, and so on and so forth. If you consider yourself a genius, you will keep spewing all kinds of statements in interviews with British clubs, and so on and so forth. So you will tend to gravitate towards actions that support your self-concept. This is called self-enhancement. You will also tend to elicit input from other people or feedback from the environment that buttresses and supports and upholds your view of yourself. So this is self-enhancement, and what propaganda does, it helps you with this. It makes it possible, it legitimizes it, and it provides you with an instant opinion poll. Because if the propaganda tells you, you belong in the Aryan race, and because you belong to the Aryan race, you're superior. And there's another 40 million people who think that way. So it can't be wrong. So it's like an instant opinion poll, you know? Hitler is a genius, and there's another 70 million people who think that way. So must be true. So the truth value of the statements embedded in propaganda is a statistical outcome. And yet, this allows you to self-enhance much more easily. If you're embedded in a liberal, progressive environment where everyone doubts everything, everything is deconstructed, morality is relative, religion is history, and so on and so forth, and you believe yourself to be a good person, it's very hard labor to substantiate this. You need to do good deeds. Then you need to ask individuals, one after the other. Then you need to gather evidence. Then you need to convince even yourself. Because you have self-doubt, because you're embedded in a critical thinking environment. And so on. So this is tedious process to uphold your self-concept. However, and by comparison, if you're embedded in the Donald Trump cult, it's a very easy process. All you need to do is flip open your smartphone and scroll across Elon Musk's post on X, and you feel upheld, you feel contained, you feel embraced, you feel that you are exactly what you think you are. Elon Musk keeps telling you that you are right, that you are virtuous, that you are, righteous.
So if I've understood this rightly, it's much harder to support a society or engender society where you expect people more to think for themselves, where you expect these what you call liberal ideals. So it's rather against democracy and ideas that...
I was talking actually about the individual level. As
Okay.
an individual, if you have this image, for example, that you're a good person, you need to invest a lot of work to cling onto this image, to buttress it, to substantiate it somehow. As an individual, you need to do good deeds. Then you need to ask people. And then you need to gather feedback and input from people. Some people will doubt you. Some people will agree with you. Some people, there's a critical thinking environment. There will be doubt. It's a mess. It's time consuming. It's energy depleting. But if you belong in a cult, or if you belong in a political movement, if you belong to authoritarian regime or something, the propaganda does all this work for you. Because if you believe that you're virtuous and you're a good person and so on, by virtue of supporting Donald Trump, all you have to do is open X and read the posts of Elon Musk. And the genius Elon Musk tells you that you're right. End of story. It's a shortcut for self-enhancement.
I see.
And yes, you're right that as individuals are self-enhanced, similarly, identically, this ipso facto creates cohesion on a collective level, on a societal level. And societies which are founded on propaganda, are much more cohesive and much more functional in my view. Democracy is not a recipe for functioning. Democracy is a recipe for addressing grievances via the fantasy of empowerment. In this sense, democracy is propaganda, of course. Just another kind of propaganda. And if I had to choose between the two propagandas, I am not quite sure that I would choose democracy. Not at all sure. And the reason that I'm not sure I would choose democracy is that it ends badly. Unfortunately, it ends badly invariably. I cannot think of a single case of a democracy that ended well. Not the Weimar Republic, not the State of Israel, not the United States, I cannot think of a single case. Because ultimately people gravitate to propaganda. Ultimately. They need this. They need this narrative. It's life-sustaining. And autocrats and so on are much better masters of propaganda than the democratic process, where there's doubt, where there's debate, where there's adversarial relationships, and so on and so forth. Checks and balances are not good for the human soul. Democracy is unnatural, exactly like monogamy. So, these unnatural constructs survive, flash in the pan. They survive for a while. And finally, and I promise finally, propaganda is motivational. It tells you what to do. It's prescriptive and proscriptive. It tells you what to do, what not to do. But it motivates you. It tells you should do this because it's good for this. It shapes the motivational powers inside you. It gives you direction, meaning, and so on, and you're suddenly energized. When we read contemporary testimonies of people in Nazi Germany, they felt wonderful. There's no exception, actually. Even former socialists felt wonderful. It's like Hitler gave them a reason to wake up in the morning. The belief that they are on some kind of historical cosmic mission. There was meaning there. There was wrong meaning, evil meaning. I agree. That's not the issue right now. Talking about the psychology. They felt élan vital. They felt the force of life. They felt libido flowing through them. Hitler had the capacity to create a fantasy that was so all-consuming and so believable that it was utopian in many ways. So, unfortunately, propaganda-based regimes are far better at motivating people than democracies.
When propaganda is used aggressively, does it change form in any way? For example, the propaganda surrounding a conflict like Ukraine. What I was talking about is how the Kosovars were labelled as harvesters of organs. These slightly more fantastical things. Is this the same stuff? It's just more aggressively targeted?
As I said, propaganda is always about othering. Is always about casting the other, whoever it may be, And the other changes, exactly like in Orwell's 1984. The adversaries change all the time. So the other changes all the time. But there's always an other, and the other is the enemy, and hostile, and malevolent, and evil, and so on and so forth. So all propaganda is aggressive. I think what you're trying to ask, perhaps, is when the aggression is externalized or verbalized or even becomes violent. I think it's a matter of degree. It's a realization of the latent potential in propaganda. Propaganda leads to violence. It's a violent act. It's a violent speech act. And it leads to violence. The aggression could be legitimized and externalized in institutional ways, and that is Donald Trump, or non-institutional ways, like the SS in Nazi Germany, but it is always ultimately externalized. There's no propaganda-based regime or situation or historical period that did not end in violence. There's no, again, exactly like democracy. Democracy always ends in a dictatorship. Propaganda always ends in violence. These are the true rules of history. These are the true and only rules of history, actually.
You mentioned that narcissists might be able to deliver propaganda. Are there groups of people or types of people with certain characteristics who excel in delivering the narratives that sustain us?
Of course. Pathological narcissism is a fantasy-based defense. Narcissists are masters of fantasy. They have evaded early childhood abuse and trauma or exploitation or instrumentalization or early childhood adversity. They've evaded it and escaped it by creating a fantasy, a false self. They are the masters of fantasy. In a world that is suffering from uncertainty and indeterminacy, fear, and so on and so forth, they are the natural default. Like people would gravitate, instead of the narcissist gravitating towards power, power would gravitate to the narcissist. It's the people who would beg the narcissist to save them somehow, because people realize that reality is threatening. Reality could be threatening. You know, we have a principle in psychology that says reality is always good. Always good. Like, the test for mental health, are you grounded in reality? Are you mindful? You're healthy. If you're not, you're not healthy. I disagree vehemently. I don't think reality is always a good thing. For example, the reality of Auschwitz, I'm quite convinced was not a good thing. You know?
Of course.
So, fantasy has its role, and so on and so forth. We may even say that the reality nowadays is so, dystonic and dissonant and dystopian and so on and so forth, that perhaps we do need a short period of fantasy to kind of recover, recuperate, regain some perspective or something. We need this escape.
So a national story or a national myth.
Something, yeah.
But then one can get to cults. You mentioned cults and religions. These are all similar, aren't they, in what you're saying?
And this is the beauty in historical processes. Whereas democracy always leads to ochlocracy, mob rule, and autocracy, autocracy and ochlocracy always lead to democracy. Ultimately, the people rebel. Ultimately, there's a revolution. Ultimately, there's the guillotine. Ultimately, ultimately the elites are decimated. And then democracy is established. So these are two competing principles. Democracy is very good for reality. It is a fantasy. It is not a fantasy. It's a propaganda, but it's reality-based propaganda. It's very good when reality is tolerable, bearable, and so on and so forth. Democracy could somehow survive and thrive. But when reality is too much, I would opt for fantasy. So I think the alternative is...
But a national myth or a story might be quite comforting. It might be quite healthy in bringing a society together collectively.
Yes. That's not always propaganda. If a national myth or story is based on the truth.
The myth would suggest it's not. But,
yeah.
but then when you get to something like a cult, these can be extremely dangerous. And when you get societies acting in a cult-like way, that perhaps America is quite cult-like today, the dangers can be extreme for the world, in America's case, as it was in the case of Nazi Germany. So how do we protect ourselves from, and how do we distinguish between perhaps the need to be in a supporter of a football team, subscribe to a national myth, and then get to the point whereby suddenly we're in territories extremely dangerous?
I don't think we can. I think it's an American way of looking at things. Everything has a solution, and if we just put our mind to it, we'll solve the problem. Many problems don't have solutions. Many diseases don't have cures. And inexorable historical processes are, as the word implies, inexorable. So I think we always gravitate. I think the sequence is democracy, ochlocracy, mob rule, and autocracy, which is always based on propaganda and a cult-like mindset, and then revolution of some kind, and then democracy, and so on. One could even say that cults and the outcomes of cults, which are always horrendous, are preconditions for democracy, and so on.
So a regrowth, like a plant.
What I'm trying to say, is I refuse to impose any kind of value judgment on the science of historiography or even on psychology. I think I told you, I'm not sure I did, I talk too much and I forget what I said to whom, but I think I told you that in psychology there's no right or wrong, bad or good. Like, is depression good for you? No, depression is horrible. We should treat it. We should medicate it. But I think if you were not depressed in Auschwitz, you were probably mentally ill.
Yes, of course.
So it's context dependent. It's context dependent. I don't know of a single democracy that was not preceded by some kind of autocracy. And I don't know of a single autocracy that was not preceded by some kind of democracy. And yes, you're right, it's a cycle of water in nature, or cycle of plant growth. Or
regrowth, sort of human societies rebuilding and deforming to be able
you
to...
need the cult. You need the cult. The cult fulfills important psychological functions and allow people to evade or avoid reality when reality becomes too threatening to one's well-being. And reality can and does become that, too menacious. Reality could disintegrate you if you let it. If you have an interface with reality which is non-mediated, non-ameliorated, then you may pay a horrible price mentally. That's why we have psychological defense mechanisms. Psychological defense mechanisms are forms of individual propaganda, like your own propaganda machine, tiny propaganda machine. So what they do, they falsify reality for you. Rationalization, projection. There's something in you that you hate. Something in you that you hate. You're a latent homosexual, or you're stingy, or you're evil, and you hate it. You don't like it. It creates in you dissonance. You don't like yourself. It's called ego dystomy. What do? You project it onto someone. So it's not me. I'm not evil. She is evil. I'm not, So projection. What is projection? The falsification of reality. You're the evil one.
Yes.
So we used psychological defense mechanisms to generate instant micro-propaganda narratives that help us to survive by reframing and falsifying reality. Period. It's the main role of psychological defense mechanisms.
You were able to identify narcissists and perhaps other people with related disorders or similar disorders as the people behind writing these narratives for us. Is it right to suggest there might be two psychological persuasions, people who have these disorders, a minority of people perhaps that we don't see or understand, and a majority of people who we might call neurotypical? Is the human story, when we're talking about cycles, is the human story, can you explain the human story through this? Is this a viable way of seeing ourselves?
I think so, and I'm not alone. You had someone like Eysenck, prominent psychologist who believed the same. So I think so. I think normal, healthy, balanced people usually gravitate or want to maintain the status quo. They cherish stability. They cherish predictability. They thrive on certainty, determinacy. They would like social structures and institutions to last forever. They are rule-based. They are conformist. So, picture of the healthy, balanced individual, grounded, happy, mindful, you name it, is someone who wouldn't budge, who refuses to move. It's someone who abhors change and motion. That's the definition of mental health. Not growth and development. Growth and development is an internal process. But someone who abhors change and motion in the external world. Someone who cherishes and thrives and is very happy when things are the same, basically. And this is not a recipe for either evolution or innovation, of course. So to innovate, to create, to evolve, you need people who dislike stability and certainty.
Yes.
And find them either boring, like psychopaths, or find them challenging and undermining, like narcissists, because in a stable environment and so on, narcissists is very unlikely to obtain narcissistic supply. And so you need to find people who push against the status quo, against the... And these people have a highly specific psychological profile, if you bear with me. So the first thing is that all these people have a compromised sense of reality. We call it impaired reality testing. They're no longer with us. They are either immersed or live within their own fantastic space, these big narcissists, or they are highly future-oriented. We call it goal-focused, goal-oriented. So this is the psychopath. These people abhor, reject reality. They find reality abhorrent, unacceptable, and something to be tempered with, or as they say in Silicon Valley, broken. You need to break things, move fast and break things. You know. And economists such as Schumpeter called it creative disruption. He believed that it's a good thing. It leads to innovation. So there is this rejection of reality. You can reject reality in a variety of ways. You can reject reality by developing a totally inflated, grandiose, fantastic self-image, self-concept. That's a narcissist. You can reject reality by saying, I'm going to shape reality in my own image. And I don't care who suffers and what's the cost. That's a psychopath. You can reject reality by saying, I don't exist, only my intimate partner exists. That's borderline. But what is common to all these people, of course, psychotics and so on, what's common to all of them is that they reject reality. And the rejection of reality is a crucial element, a precondition, precursor for exploration. What happens with a child between the ages of 18 months and 36 months is a stage in human development known as separation individuation, where the child lets go of mother. Mother is the reality. Mother is the reality principle, as Freud called it. The child lets go of reality and explores the world. Now, the child knows nothing about the world. Bear that in mind. The child knows only mother. He knows nothing about the world. And yet, he ventures forth. The child ventures forth. To do that, the child needs to be exceedingly grandiose. One would even say insane. To do that, you need to be insane.
Yes.
So it starts in early childhood with separation individuation, where the divorce from reality leads us to explore the world, to expand our horizons, to individuate and become us, to acquire an identity. Super crucial. I think what happens with narcissists, psychopaths, borderline, they're stuck in childhood. They're stuck at this stage. Definitely narcissists are stuck in the separation individuation state. And they've retained their grandiosity. And they still reject reality. They reject mother. And they explore the world. So this is point number one. Eysenck and others suggested that people who innovate, people who are creative, are somewhat crazy. Eysenck called it psychoticism. And the common term nowadays is schizotypy. So people who are creative suffer from or have schizotypy and psychoticism. These people see the world in ways which are alien to healthy, normal people. Their view of the world, their absorption of the world, perception of the world, interaction with the world, description of the world is so alien, no healthy, balanced person would recognize it. And so they have, for example, usually they have a synoptic view. They tend to connect things which are normally not associated. So they tend to form associations which are highly unusual. They have very chaotic thinking, disorganized thinking. So thoughts jumble and tumble, and then something comes out of it. It's an emergent type of thinking. They are highly dissonant and and because they're dissonant, because they have conflicting thoughts, and because there's a lot of inner battle, inner conflict inside them, they're able to think in non-conformist ways, because the non-conforming part is also an element in them. In a healthy person, conformity creates identity of thought. You have a single thought. But what if you were able to entertain two contradictory thoughts, two mutually exclusive thoughts, and own both of them? Say to yourself, both of them are my thoughts. I recognize myself in both. So then you're able to be innovative and creative and non-conforming. And that's why in ancient civilizations, madmen were prophets, messengers, because they had access to God in the sense, the universe, reality, nature. They had unfettered, unmitigated, non-mediated access to the world because they're crazy. So the psychoticism and schizotypy equip them to see the world and interact with it in ways which are totally inaccessible to healthy people. Okay, so another thing that is unusual in these people, we're talking about mentally ill people and the advantages that mental illness actually affords. Regarding mental illness is a positive adaptation in some ways, in very limited ways. The irony is this: mental illness is a positive adaptation as far as the collective is concerned. In other words, mental illness is a public good. It's not an individual good. The individual pays the price. The individual is destroyed. The individual is broken. The individual is damaged.
The mentally ill individual?
Yes. The mentally ill individual pays a very high price. And yet his mental illness, or her mental illness, is a public good.
Is it always a public good?
In the vast majority of cases, yes. Even a psychotic in an asylum, and I was exposed to these kind of people in my early 20s and so on. I worked with Yehuda Fried in Israel. I was working with psychotics. Even psychotics provide you with insights and angles and that kind of shock you out of your rut, out of your, and force you to think in unusual ways. Even the most extreme psychotics, I'm not talking about catatonics, but communicative psychotics. So, yes, mental illness is always a public good and always an individual ill. The individual pays the price for society. And again, the ancients recognized this. This is why they eulogized mental illness. That's why they said mentally ill people are in contact with God. They're the messengers of God. They're the prophets. They have such a huge advantage over us. They're saints. And they were right, because mental illness is a public good for which the individual sacrifices himself or herself, not necessarily deliberately, but that's the end result.
I see.
So individuals of this kind also have what we call attention multitasking. And everything I'm just describing does not exist, cannot be found among healthy people. These are features, clinical features, unique to mental illness. So they have attention multitasking. Attention multitasking doesn't mean that you play on your smartphone while you make coffee or something. That's multitasking. Attention multitasking is the ability to split attention into streams, several streams, that all go on simultaneously, all are cohesive and coherent, and all lead to something. mentally ill individuals are capable of doing this. Healthy people cannot.
Yeah.
Mentally ill people, especially cluster B, especially narcissists and psychopaths, they, on the one hand, are contemptuous, so they're not likely to listen to naysayers and critics and so on. Consequently, they're likely to assume risks much more than the healthy person. Yeah. So if you are not Elon Musk and someone tells you, let's build a rocket at 1/10 the price and so on and so forth, and invest all your money and your brother's money and everything in it, and you're going to sit, because you're healthy, you're balanced, you're normal, you're going to consult people, you're going to sit down, you're going to make calculations on a spreadsheet, and you're going to say, this is a very risky proposition. I'm never going to do this. But someone who is mentally ill, like Elon Musk, would just forge ahead.
Of course.
He would just go ahead. Because he's God, so he doesn't listen to critics, and he's omniscient, so he knows everything, he doesn't need to. And because he is a risk taker, he cherishes, adores risk, seeks it, flourishes in it, and so on and so forth. So risk-seeking, thrill-seeking, they are unique to mentally ill people. Healthy people avoid, they are risk-averse. It's exactly the opposite.
Yes.
So among entrepreneurs, the likelihood of finding mental illness is very high, actually. We know that, for example, the preponderance of psychopaths among chief executive officers is 5 times in the general than in the general population. So we find 5 times more psychopaths among them. We know, for example, that the psychological profile of the people who invented social media, psychological profile is that of someone with the schizoid personality disorder, the mentally ill, all of them, one and all.
Yeah.
So these people are so divorced from reality that, as far as they're concerned, it's a kind of simulation, kind of game. They are so much into, and that's why these people keep talking about simulation. The world is a simulation, the universe is a simulation, we're all, pawns in someone else's program. They really dig into this metaphor. It's all a game, and risk never has consequences, and so on and so forth. And finally, I think, ironically, mentally ill people are exposed to so much ostracism, so much stigma, so much rejection, so much mockery. They become inured, they become resilient. They're more resilient, I think, than healthy people. They are more, I know it sounds strange because mentally ill people attempt suicide and they break down and they have nervous breakdowns and they fall apart. And yes, but they survive despite the mental illness, which is pretty shocking if you come to think of it. If you have borderline personality disorder or if you're schizophrenic and you're still alive, the very fact that you're still alive is proof positive of your enormous, extraordinary resilience. I think they are extraordinarily resilient. And so if you add all this together, the divorce from reality has no impact on them. They're resilient. They seek risks. They are capable of thinking in ways which are totally inaccessible to healthy people and are also superior to normal cognition. Then, of course, you end up getting the movers and shakers and drivers and innovators and entrepreneurs and everything. They're all mentally ill. I mean,
I can see that. I find that fascinating, and I can appreciate the contribution that the broad spectrum of mentally ill people will deliver us, and understand the suffering they must go through personally. Would you apply that to all types of mental illness? A cluster Bs, which I understand to be people like the psychopaths and borderlines and narcissists. I understand that they're collectivized in this group, cluster B, because they lack empathy and caring for the rest of us. We know that abusers normally will fit in that category. So these people, are they really helping society, or how much are they? Because is it really a 2-part arrangement?
First of all, yes, I think all mental illness is helpful to society. Not only personality disorders, but takes, for example, people with bipolar disorder.
Yes.
they have what is known as manic phases. And during the manic phase, people with bipolar disorder are highly entrepreneurial. They come up with harebrained schemes to do this or to do that and so on. We can trace many innovations back to people with bipolar disorder, the manic phase specifically.
Interesting.
So that's one example.
Yes.
People with schizophrenia, of course, have contributed massively to human civilization. I think religion is just another name for schizophrenia. Yeah? Psychotic disorder. Jesus was utterly psychotic, there's no question about it. And grandiose as well, probably a psychotic narcissist. So I would generalize and say that yes, mental illness has a role to play. Autism, of course. I mean, people with autism are great mathematicians and coders and programmers and innovators, inventors, and so on. So yes, generally speaking, mental illness is good for society, good for civilization, good for the collective. Within mental illness, there are people who are both dramatic, erratic. Actually, the uniting feature of cluster B is the drama, not the lack of empathy. That's why the cluster B is called dramatic erratic cluster. So they're both dramatic on the one hand, so they need the excitement, the thrill, the risk, and they drag everyone with them, and this could, and often does, end badly. That's a drama element. And because they're disempathic, they're divorced from reality. They cannot have empathy by definition. They're divorced from reality. Schizophrenics also don't have empathy. Borderlines, we now know, have diminished empathy. So whenever you're divorced from reality, you don't have empathy because other people are not external objects. They are internal objects, or you can't recognize them because they're embedded out there, you know. So yes, they lack empathy, but I think the problem is not a lack of empathy as much as the need for drama, the need for excitement, and the willing to sacrifice absolutely everything for another dopamine hit, dopamine rush. I think that's the key risk, the key risk in accepting that mental illness is a good thing. Like, yeah, it's a good thing, but if you push it too far, in the sense that if you introduce the drama of mental illness into everyday life, you may end up as badly as mentally ill people do.
Could I try and counter that by suggesting that Adolf Hitler, had he had nuclear weapons, may have pressed the button? That wouldn't be good. Perhaps
as did Truman. Yeah.
As did Truman. Yes, absolutely. Then again, the psychopaths, the proportion of psychopaths who run companies. Some of these may be oil companies. Some of these may be companies not looking after our environment. So, to what extent does that counter your argument that they're always good for society?
That's what?
That they're good for society, because if our environment and its destruction isn't, and these people, though I can completely understand, they shift. They provide propaganda to give us narratives and stories. They shape us in many, many ways. And I can see that evolutionary, we need shaping. Of course we do. But if you're a victim of domestic abuse, you might not agree with you. If you are somebody who values the environment or lives in an environment on an island in the Pacific that's going under the water, you might not agree that they're helping us.
I didn't necessarily mean to say that they were helping. I meant to say that they were shaping.
Shaping. Okay, so
they're forming. Yeah. They're formative powers.
But do we need to contain them if the world gets to a point where we now have nuclear weapons?
Only if you seek stasis and equilibrium and homeostasis.
So we have to put up with the risk of nuclear war. We have to put up with our environment falling apart.
The cost of innovation, evolution, and so on and so forth.
And the abuse that many people have in marriages and families.
All of these are costs. In evolution as well, by the way, there are costs in evolution. Evolution tries a series of mutations. Many of these mutations end badly. The organisms die. So there's always a cost associated with progress. There is the erroneous idea of progress, that we always move in a linearly, and that it's always from worse to better. Well, that's not true at all. Evolution and progress are cyclical. And there's a lot of wastage, a lot of many failed experiments, many sacrifices and victims in the process. And I think there are side effects, very bad side effects, to the involvement of mental illness in human affairs. But I think without that involvement, we would not be where we are today. Similar to medication, I think. You know,
I find that compelling, Sam, but I do find it compelling. But give us an idea of what proportion of people in the world you're talking about here, as you would describe as broadly mentally ill. How many of us?
No, not all mentally ill people contribute to society. Not all mentally ill people are creative and so on and so forth. Generally speaking, we believe that about 15% of the population have personality disorders.
As many as that? 15%?
Yeah, 15%. Another 30 to 40% suffer from other mental illnesses. That includes mood disorders, and anxiety disorders, and so on. So half the population.
So it's a significant amount of people who are driving, and the rest of us are rather sheep-like.
Significant amount. Not all these people drive humanity forward. Not all these people shape reality for us. Not all these people provide narratives. I would say that even a tiny fraction of them do. A tiny fraction of these people do this. But everyone who does this belongs to this, is mentally ill. So it's not all mentally ill are creative, but all creative people are mentally ill, one way or another, to one degree or another. I'm not saying, you know.
Historically, in religious texts, for example, we have narratives of good and bad, evil and things like that. Do you feel that that's not really the way we should be looking at these problems? Because how can you be all bad if you are a narcissist or a psychopath, if on the other hand you are driving society and shaping it? It's a platitude.
Narcissists and psychopaths never consider themselves all bad.
They don't, but if you're a victim of abuse, you might think they're bad.
Yeah, but they perceive themselves as all good. So did Hitler, by the way. He thought he was liberating Europe from the Jews. He thought it was an act of selfless sacrifice, because the German people are paying the price, you know, for all of Europe.
Do you feel it would be better for humanity if the majority, but it's clearly not a very large majority, was better aware of the nature of people who are not like themselves? I mean, one thing that strikes me, I keep meeting people who believe, but I'm taking this narrative of good and evil because it helps me here, that, you know, there's a widespread assumption in most sensible people who would be, say, neurotypical, that there's good in everybody. But there isn't, is there? Because actually,
I don't know what is.
we're using the narrative of good and bad.
I fail to understand the concept of good and bad.
Yeah.
I've written extensively on good versus evil, and if there's a God, how can there be evil? The Odyssey, pretty extensive. Published a book on God and evil and so on. So, but I still fail to understand what good means and what evil means. For example, when you change your perspective, many evil things become very good. So that's why religious people say you can't understand evil because you don't have God's point of view. If you had God's point of view, you'd have seen that nothing is evil, all is for the better. So change your perspective, historical perspective as well. Napoleon, for example, has been demonized in Europe in the 1810s and 1820s the same way Adolf Hitler is being demonized today.
Absolutely.
The same way. Identical. Especially in the British press. Identical.
But we're not wrong to demonize Adolf Hitler, are we?
Wait a minute. 200 years later, Napoleon is beginning to say something.
You think Hitler will be?
Yes. I'm quite convinced. Yes. Napoleon is directly responsible for the death of, there's a big debate, but at the very least 3 million people.
He was a better general. He made better military decisions.
Yeah, he was a better general. But Hitler was a better statesman by far. So Napoleon was responsible for the death of 3 to 5 million people. There's a debate, but at the very least 3 million. Proportionally, if you fast forward to 1933, when Hitler ascended to power, That would be the equivalent of about 9 or 10 million people. Hitler was responsible for the death of probably 40 to 50 million. That's 4 times or 5 times Napoleon. But I don't think that's the right way to measure good and evil. Napoleon was evil in this sense. He killed 10 million, the equivalent of 10 million people.
And you still feel that, and you're of Jewish extraction.
Sorry?
And you're of Jewish extraction. You could still see Hitler being considered like Napoleon is today.
We live in Hitler's world. Everything you see around you was shaped, created, imagined by Hitler, one way or another. Every superpower was made superpower by Adolf Hitler. The way our institutions are shaped, our reactions to Adolf Hitler, the Nazi salutes of Elon Musk and Steve Bannon are Nazi salutes.
Very clearly.
Hitler is very much alive, and very much. There are two people in human history who shaped human history so dramatically that they definitely were not driven by the powers of history, but they drove history. And that would be Jesus Christ and Adolf Hitler. Indeed, if you go to Amazon, the number of books written about Jesus Christ equals the number of books written about Hitler.
I've never heard anybody describe, as I believe you just have, that Jesus Christ might be a narcissist.
Might be. A raging narcissist.
You're going to have a lot of Americans upset.
A raging narcissist.
Of course.
Not only raging narcissist, but definitely psychotic. We have this. It's called psychotic grandiosity. Definitely a sick person. Mentally ill to the core. No question about it.
And yet, we have his narrative, we have his story, we have his propaganda.
We have
or the propaganda is false.
Yes, we have a propaganda, we have a fantasy, a paracosm, we have a fantasy-based narrative, and so on and so forth. He made unrealistic demands on people. So Christianity is a serious failure, but...
As a professor of psychology and as a journalist, how does the truth fit in? How is it valuable in what you've just been saying? Because if we're to accept that the mentally unwell, and one has to ask what is normal and what isn't normal, because that's the next logical extension. They are shakers and movers, the storytellers, the people that shape our worlds, and I think that is fairly clear. We're avoiding terms like good and bad to explain things for reasons that really pull back to the fact that it doesn't really matter whether they're good or bad. Ultimately, they're still shaping society, and good and bad is more a matter of the moment. But it comes into this idea of truth. Is the truth valuable, or really should we be happier accepting propaganda, the narratives, and just accepting life as it comes?
The truth is the only valuable commodity. Nothing else.
Oh, I'm very glad you said that as a journalist.
Nothing else comes close to it.
Yeah.
However, it's unbearable. It's inhuman. It's non-human. It's unnatural to demand of people to confront the truth, to adhere to it, to accede to it. The truth is the kind of ideal that sets people up for failure. Exactly like Jesus. We mentioned Jesus. Jesus set people up for failure. His demands were not congruent with human nature. He created what Freud called an ego ideal, which was impossible to attain. And he set everyone up for failure and created a religion of guilt and shame. A guilt and shame-based religion. In this sense, Jesus is not a good person at all. You talk about good and evil. That's pretty evil, to make demands upon other people that you know damn well they could never meet. You would always feel guilty and ashamed and so on. Is this a good thing? I beg to differ. I absolutely beg to differ. In this sense, Judaism is a much better thing. Judaism is absolutely founded on human nature. You know? So, not because I'm a Jew. It's founded on human nature, simply. So, the truth is great, but it's the kind of ideal, and there are quite a few, I can name a few others. It's a kind of ideal that demands too much of people. And so people recoil. And then they're angry at the messengers. They execute them or whatever. And then there are cults and other ways to escape the truth or to escape from reality. You see, for the vast majority of the life of the human species, mental illness was considered a positive adaptation in terms of the collective, regardless of the individual price. And then we had the Enlightenment starting in the 17th century, more or less. Then we had the Enlightenment, and they said that mental illness is a bad thing. And because humans are rational agents, and you can't be a rational agent when you are mentally ill. And this kind of idea of rational agent permeated pseudo-sciences like psychology and like economics. In economics we have this rational agent.
But Sam, I'd like to be a rational agent. I strive to be a rational agent.
No one is rational, and extremely few people are agents. The idea of agency is another such ideal which is unattainable. You cannot be an agent. The idea of agency, truth, these are great things, but people reject these things because they demand too much. They create a regime which is self-sacrificial and which is self-defeating and ultimately pushes people to self-destruction. If you keep failing all the time, this accumulates, it poisons you, it's toxic.
But if you're the type of person that seeks to control your environment because you feel you can be more comfortable, then trying to establish a rational existence, is that not a way forward? Or do we should just give up, you mean, and just
not at all.
Enjoy the stories?
Not at all the way forward. People are not rational, they're emotional. So,
well, I'm English. I've been taught to control my emotions.
I think the English are the most emotional of all.
Oh, really?
Yes. I think repression is a highly emotional act. So did Freud, by the way. So, if you pose an ideal of rationality, so rationality, agency, the truth, I can go on. If you provide people with these ideals and you tell them if you're not rational, something is wrong with you. If you don't seek the truth, you're bad, you're evil. Then this sets them up for failure. They keep failing. It's toxic. They become mentally ill. They want to get away from reality. They gravitate towards cults, and you end up with Adolf Hitler. So these ideals are not good. And the people who propagated these ideas, in my view, were not good people. Not good people.
But science helps us.
Science is a different thing. Science doesn't deal with people. The so-called sciences which deal with people are pseudo-sciences, of course. They're jokes.
Yes.
Psychology is the modern astrology. It's nonsense. Unmitigated nonsense.
I haven't, apart from you, yet met anybody in psychology who feels that it's not a science. But psychology, you don't think
that you use statistics doesn't make you a scientist.
Yeah.
It's a language. Statistics is a language. That you speak Swahili doesn't make you an African. So the use of statistics borrowed from the exact sciences doesn't make you an exact science. That you wear a white coat, doesn't make you a scientist. That you have a lab doesn't make you a scientist. These are all external features. They're all kind of signaling features. They are. So this doesn't make you a scientist. Psychology cannot ever be a science, in principle. Cannot ever be a science. Because the subject matter of psychology is mutable and is reactive to experimentation. In other words, if I conduct an experiment on you, a study on you, and I want to replicate it, I can't. Even if I were to use you again as the subject matter, you have changed. The very fact that I'm experimenting on you changes you. And then if I conduct the experiment a day later, many things have happened to you during this day. You're not the same person. This is only one of the major problems. It's not a science, it's pseudoscience. Economics is a branch of psychology, of course. They're all forms of literature, but glorify, glamorize literature with the facade of science. For example, the use of mathematics and statistics. So, real science, the only real science, doesn't deal with human beings because they cannot be studied, not rigorously at least.
Are there reliable tests relatively simple ones for some of these mental disorders like narcissism or psychology,
No.
psychiatry, not psychiatry, psychopathy.
No.
Not reliable one.
The replication rate of studies in psychology is 20%. In other words, 80% of the time we fail to replicate studies and tests.
I feel that there might be some mental disorder, say in my family historically, that might have gone through. I would like to end that and try to ensure that as my family goes forward, it doesn't have that. But that's a perfectly rational, sensible thing to wish to do, isn't it? Or do you, because individuals who are psychologically disordered are, as you say, paying a huge price for it. But then I'm not helping society, am I?
You have to make a choice. You have to make a choice between public good and private good.
Because
it's a moral choice, it's not a... It's a moral choice, and it's a highly individual issue. You can't have a moral code which will tell you what to do. It's a highly individualistic.
So a miserable childhood isn't necessarily a bad thing, it's just a thing.
Depends. It's not a bad thing for society, definitely. I mean, we have thousands of writers and
but I
they
know,
all had a miserable childhood.
We've had quite a few leaders. I mean, say we have Trump today. He's not a good thing for society, is he?
He is... So again, good and bad are very difficult to define.
He's a thing.
He is providing refuge and sanctuary from reality right now. And whatever you may say about him, and I'm one of his harshest critics, as you know, one of the first critics, not only harshest, a pioneer in criticizing him. So my credentials are impeccable. But whatever you may say about Donald Trump, the American people need, above all, a refuge from reality right now. Because reality is truly intolerable and unbearable in the United States. Not so much maybe in parts of Europe, but in the United States, yes. They need to get away from reality for a while. So they can do it through the Hollywood. Hollywood is an escape from reality. They can do it by dissociating, abusing substances, and so on and so forth. And there's the alternative of Trump as well. It's a paracosm. It's a morality play. It's not real. It's a theater production. It's a movie. And he's a movie producer. And so now it's like asking, is it a good thing to make movies? Because when you make movies, people disengage from reality, and that's really bad. It's not good.
A lot of people are being hurt in Ukraine at the moment, and there does seem to be a likely scenario ahead of us where Ukraine could be abandoned by America. Already there are signs.
Has been abandoned, I think.
Yes, I think so. So that's not good for the Ukrainians. If one were, when I was a more active journalist, I used to cover conflicts, and I used to try to assess suffering and find it's quite impossible, because we're very good as humans at identifying it, seeing an individual suffering and saying, okay, that person's suffering, I can identify that. If you've got the empathy to do so, you can very easily understand it. However, what's it like for 1,000 people, 10,000 people? And then when you actually realize that if one person is killed, they may have a mother and a father and a sister and a brother, that family might lose their home. It becomes this extraordinary volume of human suffering. Surely we should be trying to avoid that and containing some of these narratives. Or do you feel that there's really no point?
Ukrainians can stop the war tomorrow.
Well, then they may pay a price of being ruled by...
So it's a choice.
But it's not...
We may justify the choice, but it's a choice. It's not an inevitability.
But the Russians and various regimes, when they occupy countries, can suppress and cause a great deal of harm.
It's a choice. It's a choice between two evils, I agree, but it's still a choice. It's not a force of nature. It's not something you can't help. It's a choice. You, as a Ukrainian, you're making a choice to continue to suffer. It's legitimate to choose to continue to suffer.
In the hope that you might have something at the end of it,
very unlikely hope, but okay, yeah. Even
sort of freedom.
If you do possess such hope, then you live in fantasy, of course. I agree with Donald Trump on this. You live in fantasy. So you may choose to live in fantasy and to propagate and perpetuate the fantasy by fighting in the front line and assuming all the sacrifices and so on that are entailed by fighting. But it's still a choice. And you, and only you, as a Ukrainian, bear the full responsibility for this choice. No one else, not the Americans, not the Europeans, not even the Russians. You bear the responsibility for the choices you make. It is a common tendency to blame others. This is called alloplastic defense.
But the Ukrainians might be able to blame the Russians for invading them, mightn't they?
They could have surrendered. It was a choice to fight.
Yes, it was a choice to fight.
Everything is a choice. If you stay in an abusive relationship, that's a choice. You are the victim. Absolutely. No one is disputing this. But you're a victim by your own choice. And when I keep saying this, I'm accused of victim blaming. I'm not. I'm just describing the situation.
No, I think
it's a choice.
It is a choice if you know it's happening.
Well, you know, when you're abused, you're abused. It's a choice. Yeah. And if you don't know what's happening, you're in fantasy. Either way, it's a choice. You choose fantasy.
You're following a narrative, aren't you?
It's true. You're choosing fantasy. That's what the Americans are doing right now. They're choosing fantasy because reality is too much for them. And Ukrainians are too real. Ukrainians are a figment of reality that intrudes upon the fantasy. And so they want to take away all the figments of reality. They isolate themselves in a bubble, fantastic bubble, and recover and recuperate. You could ask, what do Americans have to recuperate from? Like, what's the big trauma there? And so on and so forth. Well, I think the past, let's say, since Nixon, the Americans have been in trauma, a constant state of trauma. They've been repeatedly re-traumatized in a variety of ways. And so they've had it. They fell apart. Donald Trump is a sign of mental disintegration. Is the weed that grew on the garden of collapse. Americans are weak, very weak now, mentally, psychologically. Of course, we see an explosion of mental illness in the United States. Absolute explosion. So, and you can compare the United States and Europe and see the differences. Europe is fractious and far right and everything, but Europe is nowhere near the American malaise, the American.
Why do you feel that?
Europeans are embedded in a benign fantasy, have been embedded in a benign fantasy for quite a while. And this benign fantasy takes care sufficiently of the need to avoid reality. So they don't need anything further. They're not looking for anything further, you know. And the benign fantasy is, of course, the idea of Europe. It's a benign fantasy, not the European Union, which is a dystopia as far as many Europeans are concerned, but the idea of Europe, its values, its, you know, which is common also to, I think, to some extent to the United Kingdom. So there's this idea of Europe, which is cushy and cozy and fantastic, totally fantastic, by the way, totally counterfactual. It's nothing to do with history, total invention. I mean, propaganda, if we talk about propaganda, this is it, and so on. But it's sufficiently safe and secure and motivating and so on and so forth, so there's no need to do anything further. And this renders everyone essentially mentally healthy because they don't need to do anything further. Anything you see in European society that is disquieting or indicative of disruption or even mental illness and so on, I am sorry to say, was brought from the outside. It's not that the immigrants are bad. That's not what I'm saying. I'm not. But what I'm saying is that the introduction of immigrants into society created this wedge of reality that led to instability and led to an American-like situation. You know? Had the Europeans isolated themselves completely, never allowing anyone to come in, they would have been still ensconced in their fantasy, and the stability would be perfect, and everything would be, you know. So, whenever you allow reality in, you become dissonant. There's a problem because reality is harsh. It pushes back. It challenges your self-perception, your self-concept, your narratives, your reality challenges. That's what reality does. It destabilizes. It's ever-changing. It's transformative.
This cycle, inevitable cycle you're talking about, which I concede, what about AI? We have artificial intelligence could break that cycle. Is it not possible that you could have a technology that effectively maintains us in a certain point in the cycle so we never progress in it?
I am far less enamored with artificial intelligence than most analysts. I think artificial intelligence is an extension of Wikipedia, essentially. It's a form of crowdsourcing. What Wikipedia has done, and I was among the founders of Wikipedia, something you don't know maybe, what Wikipedia has done is that it has amassed or collected texts generated by people, millions of people, and then created a body of knowledge. It's just a good description of what artificial intelligence is doing. Only it's mechanized. And artificial intelligence is mechanized. In Wikipedia we had humans doing this, but it's the same. Large language model. We had huge number of texts. We put them together in the form of an encyclopedia. You have huge number of texts. You put them together in the form of answers to queries. It's exactly the same. As far as I'm concerned, artificial intelligence is extension of Wikipedia.
It was never wrong for long.
So, yes, and Wikipedia was as wrong, as hallucinating as artificial intelligence is today. As I remember the first few horrible years, and I had clashes with the founders. Don't ask an interesting personal story, maybe over lunch. So, I see it as an extension of Wikipedia in this sense, and I'm talking about generative AI. So I'm far less convinced that AI would bring about any revolution of any kind. What is worrisome about artificial intelligence is that it is authoritarian. Because if you use Google search, you get 2,000 options. The choice is yours. You're the curator. But if you talk to artificial intelligence, you get a single answer. And it's authoritative. There's no way to challenge it. You can't say you're wrong. I mean, you can, but it would lead you nowhere, basically. It's take it or leave it. It's a take it or leave it proposition. It's authoritarian. I always say that current technology reflects the mores of culture and society. We are living in an authoritarian age, so the technology is authoritarian. We were living in a narcissistic age, so we had social media. Technology reflects society, doesn't drive it. Yeah. So I'm afraid that authoritarians and their technological tech bros, the authoritarians and oligarchs would leverage AI to cement authoritarianism and autocracy. That I fully believe will happen. Because the technology lends itself to narratives that are essentially propaganda. And you already see, for example, intervention of the Chinese government in DeepSeek,
yes,
where you cannot find answers about Tiananmen and Taiwan and so on. You can see interventions by other governments. So you can see, for example, in Grok. Grok is the new AI of Elon Musk.
Yes, I've heard of it.
You try to ask Grok about Trump and Musk, and you will see that there's no criticism whatsoever. So Grok is 100% pro-Trump and 1,000% pro-Elon Musk. You can't find a single criticism. If you ask, is Elon Musk a con man? Try. See what Grok tells you.
Yeah.
Similar, use the same query with Perplexity or GPT or Claude, and you will see what you get. So they might say, there are some people who say that he's a con man and so on. Grok will tell you, no way, absolutely, it's nonsense. Yeah, I believe artificial intelligence will be leveraged by authoritarians and autocrats and oligarchs to cement their rule and regime, and also to threaten people. So they would use artificial intelligence, for example, to threaten certain professions. So, because artificial intelligence can replace certain functions and so on. So they would use it to threaten, for example, intellectuals or the finance industry, or they would use it to augment their control over specific segments of the economy. So, in this sense, I don't see anything much beyond that. You have highly specialized AI. You have like AI in medicine, AI in coding.
Yes, you do.
That's something else. That's just an extension of already existing technology. I failed to find in all of the field of artificial intelligence. I tried very hard. I've been trying for more than 3 or 4 years. I have several interviews on my channel where I go very deeply into the philosophy of AI and so on with interviewers, and I failed to find anything innovative in AI, honestly.
Interesting.
Yeah. I don't see anything innovative in it.
It's moving
It's faster.
very quickly.
It's faster.
Very quickly, isn't it?
But that's all. It's faster. I don't see anything new in it. For example, we had what used to be called expert systems. Expert system was a software that emulated a profession. So you had a medical doctor expert system. And today you have medical AI. They're indistinguishable. You had ELIZA, which was a therapist, an AI therapist in the 1950s. So that's as far as AI is concerned. I can go much deeper into the philosophy and so on and so forth, but I don't think it would be conducive to this conversation.
We haven't got very much time left. I was wondering if there's anything else that you thought you wanted to say. We've covered quite a lot of ground, haven't we?
Quite a lot of ground. Perhaps.
And I think I quite like the fact that it's saying things that you don't normally hear on this. I haven't heard this before.
I'm not trying to be provocative on purpose.
Yeah.
It's just that very few people try to gain a synoptic view. For example, to compare periods in history which are not limited to the last 5 years. Or let's take 5,000 years. You know. Let's compare people from different eras that have a huge common denominator. You need to travel in time to make sense of your reality, of your current situation.
Absolutely.
And extremely few analysts are doing this. Extremely few analysts. So even in the Ukraine-Russia conflict, which I'm 100% pro-Ukraine. I volunteered. I organized a whole network of mental health practitioners and professionals, well over 100 people, and we trained people in Ukraine to cope with PTSD, and I did a lot. I invested. I was expelled from Russia, so I'm not exactly pro-Russian. But the truth is, if you gain a larger perspective, a longer perspective, you're beginning to see things a bit differently. Ukraine is not the innocent lamb that it makes itself out to be. And Russia is not the unmitigated, horrendous, malevolent aggressor that it is made out to be. The more perspective you gain, the more nuance you gain. The more nuance you gain, the more you find it extremely difficult to make judgments, especially in terms of good and bad.
No, I agree with that. I agree with that. And I must say, I've been coming to understand, certainly to the extent I understand personality disorders, and moving away from the idea that you judge good and bad, because I think it limits you to understanding what's really going on.
It's bad. You can't say that abuse is good. It's bad. I think it's only a question of what is your lens. If it's individual and in lens of individualism or individual lens, then you can perhaps use bad and good.
Yeah.
But the minute you emigrate and you begin to adopt a collective lens or a historical lens, I think these distinctions are totally
They're not helpful.
Counterproductive, yes. Not helpful.
They're not helpful. Very interesting.
Thank you.
Well, I'm out of questions. I don't need to record anymore either. I'm very pleased with that. And Sam, thank you very much for
Thank you.
giving up your time.
Always a pleasure. Thank you.
To speak to me again.